Faith is a powerful thing. Having faith that your long-term goals will work out, even if they don't currently feel like it, can help you to hang in there until your goals actually do start working out. Now, I just need to say, when I say faith, I don't mean just religious faith. I mean the faith of committing to your vision, to your long-term goals. It would seem that since the start of time, there have been these people who hold on to their faith no matter what happens. And then on the other side, there have been these cynics who take pride in shooting down a person's faith and persistence, all because they want to be realistic. Often these people's pride comes in feeling like they know what it really is to have the truth. But firstly, we should remember that the people who take the more faith-driven approach are generally the ones that end up shaping the world that we live in, who shape our truth. Secondly, as we'll explore today, that idea of having the final of truth of what is really realistic, as many of the cynics might say, that idea is not actually as solid ground as it might seem for these people. But today, I don't want to try and convince you that you should have a simple faith that you can just 100% trust and close your eyes to everything else around you or that's happening to you. Because while faith is a powerful thing that we really can utilize on our journeys, we need to remember that our journeys are an active force in the world that we live in. That the things that we do actually affect the people around us. And so it's important for us to keep our eyes open to the world that we're living in and that we're walking through. We can draw on the great power of having faith, of practicing faith, but we need to wield a responsible faith. And that's what we're exploring on today's episode.
Welcome to Redlily Radio. Radio.
I'm your host, John Ostman. I've been wrestling with a question recently, and my question is this: can a person simply have faith that their chosen journey is good for the world? Or would that kind of simple trust actually become destructive in some circumstances that they might find themselves in? I recently watched a movie called Silence by Martin Scorsese, which came out in 2016. And this movie follows two Portuguese Catholic missionaries who are on a journey into the heartland of 17th century Japan. Now, this is a Japan where Christianity was strictly outlawed and where the Christians, whether they're missionaries or whether they're locals, they were all being tortured and they were all being killed. Now, just a quick warning, this podcast episode will contain some spoilers for the film, but either way, I highly recommend that you watch it, especially if the themes that we talk about do sound interesting to you. It's a very great meditative film, very beautifully shot. It's a fantastic experience. And it's been a long time since I've been left wrestling with the themes of a movie for days or even a week after seeing it. Silence, the movie, very much did this for me, but it did it in a positive way. You see, these two missionaries, they're going to Japan to try and find their own mentor, whose name is Ferreira, who he's been rumoured to have renounced his faith in the face of these hellish punishments that the Japanese have been enacting on the followers. The film ultimately centres on one of these missionaries, whose name is Rodriguez, who, wishing to act as much like his Jesus as possible, he's determined to cling onto his faith against all odds. Now, we've heard this kind of story many times in many inspirational movies. You know, just stick to your guns, commit to your end goal, don't budge for anyone, no matter what. The difference in Silence is that we're presented with a situation that reveals that there are actually dangers of this kind of thinking. You see, the Japanese officials begin torturing other new converts, and they tell Rodriguez that they will only stop if he himself renounces his faith. It's now no longer a situation of, I can live and die a hero myself. Rodriguez has been comforting himself several times throughout the film, saying that martyrs are the seeds of the church. But what should he do now that his commitment to his faith is actually in some ways causing the deaths and the torturing of others who are not choosing to become martyrs themselves? As the movie rolls on, we begin to get some more insights from some of the Japanese guards and generals, who say that many of the missionaries that they have had come to the land haven't actually bothered to learn the Japanese language. The Japanese generals, on the other hand, have actually learned enough Portuguese to have honest discussions with these outsiders who are coming into their land. In addition to this, there is one crucial discussion which takes place between one of the lead governors and Rodriguez, in which the governor explains that Japan currently has these 4 colonial Western powers, that's England, Spain, Holland, and Portugal, all fighting each other to come into the country with their ideas and their customs. And that to protect the house that is Japan, the Japanese need to keep out these unwanted missionaries and their dangerous ideas from spreading. It's here that we start to see that things aren't so black and white, and that perhaps Rodriguez's blind clinging to his faith and his way of doing things perhaps isn't as heroic as it first seems. Now, there have been a number of different interpretations of the film. Some people say that it's clear that the Christian missionaries are actually the persecuted heroes, and that the anti-Christian Japanese were evil for their methods. Some people say that the film is actually a criticism on Western colonialism, coming into countries and trying to change them without actually any respect for their current traditions or their current ways of life. These people say that it was actually the Portuguese missionaries who were in the wrong for blindly following their egos and not being willing to take the time to learn the Japanese culture, the Japanese language, or the Japanese point of view. Either way, this movie, which is grounded in a very real historical context, by the way, paints for us one of the complex and extreme situations that faith-committed people have actually found themselves in real life. There is another message we can take from this film though, and this is one that I believe can teach us a very wise and effective way to live in our world while still holding on to our faith. And we will get to that, but first we need to explore a few other points. So why is faith so powerful, especially blind faith? It's because it gives us a feeling of certainty, and we want certainty. Many of us want to know the single truth that will set us free, and the truth that we can follow, and then we can know for sure that things won't go wrong for us. We want to know that truth that means that we will be successful and our path will be good for everyone around us, 100%. We want to be able to sit down and read that one right book that teaches us the simple how, and then we're good to go. It's incredibly alluring. I know that all too well. You kind of don't get into a field like personal coaching without eating through a good number of resources that all claim to have the one final answer in one form or another. But as the 18th century philosopher Voltaire noted, doubt is not a pleasant condition, but certainty is absurd. Voltaire explains that every fact and theory in history has been revised at some point. And so it is a pretty safe assumption that every truth that we know about the world isn't going to be the final truth. It can be easy for us to look back and say that perhaps he was only just speaking to the religious people of the time, but he wasn't. Voltaire's message speaks to us here and now, whether you follow science or religion or your own philosophy or intuition. The problem is, if we leave things just there, we can be left with a feeling of, well, what's the point of finding truth if there is no set truth to find anyway? To help us with this, we need to jump forward 100 years or so, and then we need to look at some of the early proponents of the pragmatic strain of philosophy. We're talking about people like John Dewey, Charles Sanders Peirce, and William James. These pragmatists argue that the point of philosophy should be to create philosophies which actively help people to live better lives in our world. This was perhaps a response to earlier philosophies which, while were intellectually stimulating, didn't actually change the way people were able to interact with the world for the better, or in some worse cases, there were philosophies which actually detached people from their worlds in an unhealthy way. Charles Sanders Peirce gives us the example of one philosopher who might present us with the idea that diamonds are actually soft until they are touched. And when they're touched, diamonds become hard. Now, this philosopher would say that we had always assumed that diamonds were hard because they're always hard while we're interacting with them. And there's no way to actually prove this philosopher wrong. But Peirce argues that while this idea is practically impossible for us to disprove, this philosophy doesn't actually give us any real benefit in our ability to work with diamonds or with the world, and so we should ask how useful this philosophy is. If we look at why we seek answers from science or religion or any other mental model for that matter, we realize that it's because we believe that they will help us to know the world more clearly. Why do we want to know the world more clearly? Well, because we want to be more in control of our fates. We want to be less disrupted or damaged by unforeseen tragedies or circumstances. We want to be able to see and leverage the resources and opportunities that are around us. Now, this mirrors what the pragmatists are telling us. When we look at ideas for how truthful they are, what we are perhaps actually looking for, and what we should be looking for, is how useful these ideas are. That perhaps usefulness is a more appropriate term than truthfulness. Now, this doesn't mean to lie to yourself, because lying to yourself usually ends up in giving yourself like a distorted worldview, detached from the world that you actually live in, and this ultimately becomes less useful. However, if we recall the message from Voltaire earlier, every truth eventually gets replaced by a better truth. Every model that we have will end up being replaced by a more useful model. If we look at a real-world example of this, Isaac Newton's laws of motion were considered unbreakable truths in how the natural world works. And they really were the most truthful/useful model that we had for understanding the motion of objects. At least they were up until we entered the quantum physics realm. It's here that Newton's laws stopped working how we expected, and they stopped being as useful. Now today, thanks to the groundbreaking work by Albert Einstein and all the hardworking scientists who have worked in these fields since, we have two competing models for how motion actually works in the world. There's one called quantum mechanics, and there's one called general relativity. Now, the current problem that we're facing is that the model of quantum mechanics works really well at the level of very small objects. Now we're talking subatomic particles here. General relativity, on the other hand, works very well at the level of very large objects, such as galaxies, black holes, and the universe itself. But neither of these models actually work well in the other model's domain. And so at this current time, we ask, alright, which one of these models is the truth? Well, neither one is the final truth, but they are both still incredibly useful, and they are currently the most useful models that we have, up until we find one that is more useful, and perhaps more useful for all domains. Even though we can't call them final truths, it doesn't mean they're not useful, because the insights of general relativity, for example, were useful enough to open up the technologies of our GPS that you use for Google Maps, or atomic energy that's used in nuclear reactors. Quantum mechanics, likewise, has provided us the useful conceptual tools to develop solar cells for solar panels, many of our modern microelectronics, and the Large Hadron Collider, the particle accelerator that's over in Geneva in Switzerland. We can use these truths, but we need to accept these truths are not final. And one very useful way to look at our understanding of the world is that it is evolving, and that we can have faith that we are actually able to wrestle with and discover more and more useful models of looking at things as time goes on. And this will allow us to move forwards, and it will allow us to transcend our current boundaries. These are boundaries that we've taken for granted, by the way. This conceptual evolution seems to be true on a global and humanity level, but it also seems to be true on a personal and individual level. Now, this potential for evolving conceptual models and finding new and creative paths forwards opens up an attitude called the third way approach. To give you an idea of this, let's look back at the movie Silence that we examined right at the start of the episode. Towards the end of the film, the missionary Rodriguez has been through a barrage of trials and tribulations for holding on to his faith. He has seen his friends and fellow Christians tortured and killed for their beliefs and for his own stance. He has seen his own teacher and mentor, Ferreira, turn from the faith that Rodriguez holds so strongly. And then he comes to a point where he is asked to renounce his own faith again to save the lives of 5 other innocent Japanese civilians. Up until and including this point, the choice that Rodriguez has faced has seemed so binary. Should he keep to his values of never renouncing his faith, but have to continue to watch the people around him tortured and killed as a result? Or should he renounce and save the lives of these people around him, but then have to live the rest of his life in Japan as a non-Christian? If you want to know how things play out, I recommend you watch the movie yourself. But here is where the third way approach comes in. There are so many times in life where we are presented with a situation in which there seems to be only 2 options, and it can be very hard to know which option is the right one to pick. Each may have an endless list of pros and cons, and we are left racking our heads and our hearts trying to choose. The third way approach tells us that there is always a third way, a third option. And if we are creative in developing and finding another new option, it may end up being clearly the best option. Do I work in engineering or do I work in the arts? Do we use our money on this important thing that we need, or do we use it on this other important thing that we need? Do I fight the system head on, or do I just go with the flow? On episode 142 of his own podcast, Rob Bell offers a great exploration into third way thinking through the Christian tradition. In particular, he explains how the phrase, "turn the other cheek," which these days is often seen as a voice of passivity, was actually an incredibly subversive, non-violent tactic in its original context. I'll throw in a link to that episode in the show notes on the Redlily coaching website, so if you're interested, you can go listen to it afterwards. So how does this third way approach tie together with the faith that we've been talking about? Well, the great thing is it means that you can keep the faith in your end goal coming true, but you don't have to ignore the reality of the situations that you find yourself in. Use your faith as a direction and a trust that you will be able to find a way through, and that this way might be the third way, and it might be a creative way, a more nuanced way that actually benefits you and benefits everyone around you. It means that you don't have to be trapped as a prisoner of this binary way of thinking, that there's only two options that you can choose from. There is always a third option. But this is also a calling for us to use our faith responsibly, to not blindly follow a faith without question, without wrestling, but to responsibly work through it and evolve it as our understanding of the world around us evolves. There is one line that I believe captures this all very well in the movie Silence, and it's said to Rodriguez towards the end of the film, and I believe it is the crucial point which opens up the third way approach for him. Rodriguez, talking to his mentor Feria about how he prays and prays, but still there are people being tortured on his behalf. Feria responds, "Pray, but pray with your eyes open." And so my hope for you is this, that you can leverage the power of having faith, that trust that your long-term goals can come true even if you don't feel it right now. But that you can do so with your eyes open to the real world around you and the worlds that you find yourself in. And that whatever situation you find yourself in, that you remember there is always a third way that you can find that will open up your path to be healthier for yourself and for those around you. Redlily Radio is produced as part of Redlily Coaching, and that soundtrack that you just heard was actually specifically composed for this episode. If you like what you heard, head to our Patreon page, because there you can join as a patron and get access to the full track, along with all our other content that we post for our supporters there. Otherwise, guys, until next time, have a great journey.